I want to start today by making a distinction that I think is going to reframe everything you thought you understood about the avoidant in your life. Because the word avoidant gets used as though it describes a single, uniform psychological type, as though everyone who withdraws, who creates distance, who seems to run from intimacy at the precise moment intimacy becomes most real, is operating from the same internal architecture and responding to the same underlying fears. They are not. There are meaningful and important distinctions within avoidant attachment that shape everything: how the person experiences love, how they process threat, what they are actually running from when they run, and crucially, what reaches them when nothing else does. And the distinction I want to focus on today is the one that I find produces the most confusion, the most pain, and the most persistent misunderstanding in the people who love them. The dismissive avoidant, not the fearful avoidant who carries an anxious longing beneath the distance and whose withdrawal is characterized by the specific anguish of wanting connection and being terrified of it simultaneously. The dismissive avoidant is a different psychological architecture entirely, and understanding the difference, understanding what the dismissive avoidant is actually made of, what their particular wound looks like, and what functions as their kryptonite, is the conversation I want to have today. Completely, honestly, and with the precision this topic deserves. Let me start with what distinguishes the dismissive avoidant from other avoidant types at the level of their core psychological organization. Because the distinction is not simply one of degree, more avoidant, less avoidant. It is a distinction of kind. The fearful avoidant knows they want connection. The wanting is painful and frightening and wrapped in the expectation of eventual devastation. But it is present and it is felt, and it creates the particular cycling behavior, approach, retreat, that characterizes their relationships. They are ambivalent about intimacy in the specific way of someone who is pulled towards something they simultaneously fear. The dismissive avoidant has organized their psychology around a more complete solution to the problem of needing. They have not simply learned to fear connection. They have learned, with a thoroughness that goes all the way down to the level of identity, to genuinely not consciously experience the need for it. They have constructed a self that does not require, a life that is sufficient unto itself, an identity built so completely around self-reliance and emotional independence that the absence of deep connection does not register as loss. It registers, when it registers at all, as freedom. This is the foundational difference, and it is what makes the dismissive avoidant simultaneously the most difficult type to reach and the most transformed when reaching actually happens. Because their defenses are not the defenses of someone who is afraid of something they want. They are the defenses of someone who has convinced themselves, at the deepest level of psychological self-organization, that the thing being defended against is not something they want at all. To reach the dismissive avoidant, you have to reach past a story they have been telling themselves for their entire adult life. I want to describe the dismissive avoidance psychological landscape with some specificity, because I think most people who have loved one have a partial picture, accurate in some places, distorted in others, and the distortions tend to be precisely in the areas that matter most. The dismissive avoidance early experience, almost universally, involved caregivers who were emotionally unavailable in a specific way. Not necessarily cruel, not necessarily absent in the physical sense, but consistently unresponsive to emotional need. The child who reached for attunement, for the felt sense of being understood, received, emotionally met by the person they depended on, and consistently encountered either indifference, discomfort, or a subtle but unmistakable message that emotional need was inappropriate, excessive, or a burden. What this child learned was not simply that this particular caregiver was unavailable. What they learned, at the level of the nervous system where the deepest lessons are written, was that emotional need itself was the problem, that the feelings requiring external witness and response were the source of the discomfort, theirs and their caregivers, and that the solution was to stop having those feelings, or at minimum to stop expressing them in any way that would require another person to respond. So they internalized the caregiver. They became their own emotional responder. They developed a self-sufficiency that was, in the context of that early environment, a genuinely adaptive solution. They stopped needing because needing was not safe. They became capable because capability was what the environment rewarded. and they organized their identity around that capability with such completeness that by the time they reached adulthood, the identity was not experienced as a defense, it was experienced as who they were. This is the crucial point. The fearful avoidant knows, on some level, that the walls are walls. The dismissive avoidant has lived inside the walls long enough that they have become indistinguishable from the landscape. They are not defending themselves against connection. In their experience, they simply do not need it. And any suggestion that they do is not received as insight, it is received as projection. Now I want to talk about what the dismissive avoidance kryptonite actually is, because this is the heart of what I want to explore today, and I want to be precise about it in a way that most people in this space are not. The kryptonite of the dismissive avoidant is not emotional intensity, not patient devotion, not consistent, unconditional availability, not the kind of love that makes itself permanently accessible in the hope that the accessibility will eventually feel safe enough to be received. All of those approaches, however well-intentioned, however genuinely loving, tend to produce the opposite of the intended effect. They activate the dismissive avoidant's primary defense, which is a deeply ingrained, essentially automatic response to perceived emotional demand. The kryptonite is something far more specific, and it operates through a channel that the dismissive avoidance defenses were never built to block, because they never anticipated needing to block it. The kryptonite of the dismissive avoidant is secure self-possession that makes no case for itself. Let me unpack that, because each element of that phrase matters. Secure, not performed security, not the brittle composure of someone who is working hard to appear unaffected while being significantly affected. Genuine psychological security, the kind that comes from a settled, honest, non-defensive relationship with one's own interior life. The kind that does not require external validation to sustain itself. The kind that the dismissive avoidant, in all their carefully constructed self-sufficiency, has been trying to approximate their entire life and has never quite achieved, because genuine security requires the integration of vulnerability rather than its elimination, and the dismissive avoidant has been eliminating vulnerability rather than integrating it. Self-possession. The complete, unapologetic ownership of one's own emotional experience, one's own needs, one's own depth, without either concealing it to make others comfortable or performing it to make oneself seem more interesting. Self-possession, in this sense, is the opposite of both neediness and suppression. It is the full presence of a person who knows who they are and requires no external confirmation of that knowledge. That makes no case for itself. This is perhaps the most important element, and the one that is most difficult to sustain in practice. The dismissive avoidance defenses are specifically calibrated to respond to emotional argument, to the implicit or explicit case being made for connection, for depth, for the relationship's significance and the other person's need to have that significance acknowledged. Every time that case is made, the dismissive avoidance system recognizes it as the emotional demand it was trained to identify as the precursor to loss of self, and it responds accordingly. With distance, with the calm, infuriating, apparently genuine indifference that is the dismissive avoidance' most consistent defensive output. But the person who carries their depth without making a case for it, who is simply quietly, undeniably themselves in a way that requires nothing from the dismissive avoidant to justify, does not trigger the defense in the same way. Because the defense was built to respond to need, and this person does not appear to need anything. What they have instead is presence. And presence, in the specific quality I am describing, is the one thing the dismissive avoidance defense system was never designed to manage. I want to go deeper into why this specific quality functions as kryptonite, because understanding the mechanism is what will allow you to distinguish between what actually reaches a dismissive avoidant and what the dismissive avoidant has trained the people around them to believe reaches them. The dismissive avoidant has organized their entire identity around being the most self-contained person in any dynamic they enter, the one who needs least, the one whose emotional world is the most self-sufficient and the most internally resourced, the one whose happiness, whose equanimity, whose sense of self does not depend on any particular person's presence or absence. This identity is the central pillar of everything. It is what allows the dismissive avoidant to create distance without experiencing it as loss. It is what allows them to move through relational endings with what appears to be remarkable composure. It is what allows them to maintain, in their own internal narrative, the position of someone who chooses rather than needs, someone whose engagements with other people are elective rather than essential. When the dismissive avoidant encounters someone who carries a comparable degree of self-possession, genuinely, not as a performance, the identity pillar is suddenly no longer unique. The thing the dismissive avoidant used to define themselves against is no longer the defining contrast. There is another person in the room who does not appear to need them, who is not organized around their presence or destabilized by their distance, who carries their own interior life with a completeness and a security that does not reference the dismissive avoidant at all. And for the dismissive avoidant, this is disorienting in a way that few other experiences are, because the entire relational dynamic they are accustomed to operating within has just been reorganized. The person who was supposed to be the more emotionally available, more affected, more reaching party, the person around whose need the dismissive avoidant was quietly but definitively orienting their sense of relational power, is not playing that role. There is no role being played at all. There is just a person, self-complete, genuinely unconcerned with managing the dismissive avoidant's comfort level, present without agenda. And the dismissive avoidant, who has spent their entire life being the most self-sufficient person in the room, has just met someone who does not appear to need them to be anything. That is the kryptonite, the meeting of genuine self-possession with genuine self-possession. The encounter with someone who is not impressed by the dismissive avoidant's independence because they have their own. Now I want to describe what happens inside the dismissive avoidant when they encounter this, because the internal experience is one of the most genuinely surprising things I have observed in my work, given everything we know about the dismissive avoidant's constructed psychology. The first thing that happens is attention. Deep, involuntary, almost irritated attention. The dismissive avoidant notices the person who is not chasing them with an intensity that is precisely proportional to their surprise. Because in the relational landscape, the dismissive avoidant is accustomed to navigating, people eventually reveal their need. Eventually the reaching starts. Eventually the emotional hunger becomes visible, and the dismissive avoidance system can relax back into its familiar position of the less affected party. When that revelation does not come, when the person across from them continues to be simply, securely, undemandingly themselves, the dismissive avoidance attention escalates into something that functions almost like irritation, as though the other person is withholding something the dismissive avoidant has a right to expect. The not needing reads, at a below-conscious level, as a provocation, not because the dismissive avoidant wants to be needed in any consciously acknowledged sense, but because the absence of the familiar dynamic has removed the relational script they rely on, and without the script, they do not know quite where they stand. And not knowing where they stand is one of the few experiences that genuinely disturbs the dismissive avoidant's composure. Following the attention and the irritation comes something that the dismissive avoidant will find extremely difficult to sit with and will almost certainly not acknowledge. It is curiosity, genuine, escalating, increasingly preoccupying curiosity about who this person actually is. The dismissive avoidant is not, in general, deeply curious about the interior worlds of the people around them. This is not because they are incapable of interest. It is because the investment required for genuine curiosity about another person's interior world is the same investment required for genuine connection, and the dismissive avoidance system manages both through the same mechanism of controlled disengagement. But the person who carries secure self-possession, without making a case for it, presents the dismissive avoidance curiosity with a genuine puzzle. The usual signals that allow for categorization, the emotional availability that can be filed under needs too much, or the emotional reserve that can be filed under not interesting enough, are absent. What is present instead is something that resists the available categories. A person who is clearly feeling, clearly alive, clearly in possession of an interior world of genuine depth and complexity, but who is not deploying any of it in the direction of the dismissive avoidance validation or attention. What is this person like when they are not performing for anyone? What do they actually want? What moves them? What is underneath the self-possession that is not defended composure but seems to be something more genuinely earned? The curiosity is uncomfortable because it is the first movement of genuine interest, and genuine interest is the first movement toward genuine attachment. And genuine attachment is precisely what the dismissive avoidance entire psychology was constructed to prevent. But curiosity does not ask permission. It does not check with the defense system before arriving. It simply arises in the presence of something genuinely surprising, and the dismissive avoidant finds themselves thinking about the person with a frequency and a specificity that their system has no ready mechanism to suppress. The third stage of what happens when the dismissive avoidant encounters their kryptonite is the most significant and the most revealing. It is the emergence of something I have observed consistently in dismissive avoidance who encounter genuinely self-possessed people, and it is something that those people almost never expect to see. Effort. The dismissive avoidant begins to make effort, not the performative effort of someone who is interested enough to engage on their own terms. Genuine effort, the kind that involves adjusting their behavior in response to another person's preferences, the kind that requires them to step outside the comfortable self-referential orbit of their own needs and interests and direct real attention towards someone else's experience. This is remarkable in the context of everything I have described about the dismissive avoidance psychology, because effort of this kind is precisely what the dismissive avoidance system is organized to minimize. Every relationship the dismissive avoidant has been in prior to this encounter has eventually settled into a dynamic where the effort flows predominantly in one direction, toward them, where the other person accommodates, adjusts, reaches, makes the space for connection comfortable for the dismissive avoidant at the cost of their own comfort. The person who carries their own self-possession does not make that accommodation, not from hostility, simply because they do not organize themselves around the dismissive avoidant's comfort level. And the dismissive avoidant, who does not want to lose the interesting, uncategorizable presence of this particular person, finds themselves doing something they have not done in a very long time. Trying. I want to be honest about something here that I think requires saying directly. The kryptonite I am describing is not a strategy. I cannot say this with sufficient emphasis. It is not a set of behaviors to adopt in order to produce a specific response in a dismissive avoidant. It cannot be performed. It cannot be manufactured through technique or deployed through calculation. The secure self-possession I am describing is either real or it is not. And if it is not real, if it is a performance of self-sufficiency rather than the genuine article, the dismissive avoidant will detect the inauthenticity with the same precision that I described in a previous conversation. Because the dismissive avoidant, who has spent their life managing their own interior performance, is one of the most finely calibrated detectors of performed emotion in any room they enter. The gap between genuine self-possession and the performance of it is not visible to most people. To the dismissive avoidant, it is immediately, uncomfortably obvious. What this means practically is that the kryptonite is not something you develop in order to affect them. It is something you develop for yourself. It is the natural product of the same work I have been describing throughout this entire series of conversations. The work of knowing yourself honestly, of healing the wounds that made their patterns so destabilizing, of arriving at a relationship with your own interior life that does not require the dismissive avoidance acknowledgement to be real. If you do that work, fully, honestly, not as a strategy but as a genuine commitment to your own wholeness, you will become, as a natural consequence, someone who carries the specific quality that the dismissive avoidance defenses were never built to withstand. And if you do that work and the dismissive avoidant remains unmoved, if the secure self-possession you have genuinely developed does not produce the curiosity and the effort and the eventual tentative lowering of walls that it produces in dismissive avoidants who are capable of growth, then that information is equally valuable, because it tells you something definitive about where the dismissive avoidant is in their own process, about whether their system is currently capable of the response that genuine attachment requires, about whether waiting for that response is the best use of the wholeness you have built. There is one more dimension of the dismissive avoidance kryptonite that I want to explore before I close, because I think it is the element that carries the most transformative potential and the least attention in most conversations about this attachment type. The dismissive avoidance constructed self-sufficiency is not, at its deepest level, a preference. It is a compensation. It is what grew in the space where attunement should have been, where the early experience of being genuinely met, emotionally, specifically, with the fullness of another person's receptive presence, should have taught the child that connection was safe enough to seek and stable enough to sustain. That attunement never fully arrived, or arrived inconsistently enough that it could not be relied upon as the foundation of a relational identity. And so the dismissive avoidant built a different foundation, one that required nothing external to sustain it, one that was, in every meaningful sense, a solution to the specific problem of an early environment that could not be trusted to meet the need. The kryptonite reaches the dismissive avoidant not only through the quality of self-possession I have described, it reaches them through the implicit, lived demonstration of what genuine attunement actually looks like. Because the person who carries secure self-possession without agenda, who is genuinely present without need, who sees the dismissive avoidant clearly and warmly without either idealizing or fixing, that person is providing, in the very texture of their presence, the thing the early environment withheld. Not demanding it, not offering it in exchange for something, simply having it and being it, and allowing its presence to exist in the shared space between them without requiring the dismissive avoidant to do anything particular with it. And at that level, the level beneath the identity, beneath the constructed self-sufficiency, beneath the decades of learned not needing, the dismissive avoidance system encounters something it has been quietly, privately, almost unconsciously hungry for their entire life. The experience of being with someone whose presence is genuinely, completely safe. Not safe because they will never leave, not safe because they are endlessly accommodating, safe because they are real, because they are not performing for the dismissive avoidance benefit or shaping themselves around the dismissive avoidance comfort, because their presence is not contingent and their depth is not deployed and their self-possession is not a tactic, just a person, whole, genuine, asking for nothing more than what is authentically available. That is the kryptonite. The one thing the dismissive avoidance elaborate, decades refined, structurally impressive defense system was never built to resist. Because it was never built to resist the thing it was actually built to find. Somewhere beneath all of the not needing, beneath all of the self-sufficiency, beneath the entire constructed architecture of someone who decided, at an age when no child should have to make such a decision, that needing was too dangerous to risk. There is a person who has been waiting their entire life for exactly this. For someone who does not need them to be anything other than what they are. For someone whose presence is not a demand, but an invitation. For someone who is secure enough in their own wholeness to hold space for the dismissive avoidance gradual, terrifying, entirely unprecedented journey toward their own. That is the kryptonite, and it is the only thing that has ever worked.